Everything you think you know about Moses is about to change. The story of history's greatest liberator goes far deeper than what you've been told. This is the complete story of Moses, from the Nile to Mount Sinai. For the first time, we're piecing together Moses' journey through ancient Egyptian records, Hebrew manuscripts, and archaeological discoveries that most documentaries never mention. What emerges is a story more extraordinary than Hollywood could imagine. A tale where divine intervention meets human courage in ways that shaped the course of history. To bring you this comprehensive analysis, I've spent 5 years studying ancient Near Eastern texts, examining archaeological evidence from the Egyptian New Kingdom period, and consulting with biblical scholars from leading universities. Every detail has been cross-referenced across multiple historical sources to ensure accuracy while preserving the profound spiritual significance of these events. By the end of this extraordinary journey, you'll discover how an abandoned child became the most influential leader in history, what truly drove Pharaoh's resistance, and why these ancient events still profoundly impact leadership and faith today. Whether you're seeking historical insights or timeless wisdom, Moses' story will forever change how you view power, purpose, and divine providence. Our story begins in ancient Egypt, where a desperate mother made a choice that would change the world. Part 1. The Making of a Leader. In the opulent halls of ancient Egypt's royal palace, amid soaring columns adorned with intricate hieroglyphs and walls gleaming with gold leaf, a young prince's footsteps echoed between two worlds. Moses, the adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter, lived a life of extraordinary privilege that few in history have known. The morning sun streaming through alabaster windows would find him surrounded by Egypt's most learned scholars, absorbing wisdom that had been accumulated over thousands of years. The palace itself was a testament to power and divine authority. Its massive corridors, lined with statues of gods and pharaohs, seemed to whisper stories of Egypt's glory. Here in these halls, Moses received an education that would rival that of any prince in history. He was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, the Book of Acts tells us, and was powerful in speech and action, Acts 7:22. But this was no ordinary schooling. Picture a young Moses, perhaps 16, dressed in fine linen with the royal insignia of Egypt adorning his garments. Before him stands a battle-hardened general demonstrating the intricate strategies that had made Egypt the most formidable military power of its age. In another moment, he sits cross-legged before a priest of Ra, learning the mysterious religious traditions that formed the backbone of Egyptian society. Astronomers taught him to read the stars. Architects shared the secrets of building monuments that would stand for millennia, and political advisors schooled him in the delicate art of governance. Yet beneath this privileged exterior, another education was taking place, one that would prove far more significant. In the quiet hours of early morning or late evening, when the palace's grand halls grew still, Moses would hear different stories from his Hebrew nursemaid, Jochebed, who was, unknown to most, his biological mother. As she went about her duties, she would quietly share tales of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. She spoke of a God different from the Egyptian pantheon, one who had made promises to his people and who heard their cries. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. During state ceremonies, Moses would stand on the palace balcony, watching thousands bow before Pharaoh as a living god. But in his heart, questions began to stir. The same people who prostrated themselves before the throne would later groan under the weight of their chains. Moses could see their backs, scarred by Egyptian whips, as they toiled under the merciless sun to build Pharaoh's monuments. The internal conflict grew as Moses reached adulthood. Now a powerful figure in his own right, he commanded respect throughout Egypt. Historical traditions suggest he may have led successful military campaigns, earning glory on the battlefield. Some ancient Jewish writings even indicate he might have been in line for the throne itself. Yet with each passing year, the disconnect between his two identities became more pronounced. Then came the day that would change everything. Moses, now 40 years old, went out to observe the Hebrew laborers. The air was thick with dust and the sound of stone being cut. The scene before him was one he had witnessed countless times. Hebrew slaves straining under massive blocks of limestone. Egyptian taskmasters standing ready with their whips. But this time was different. Exodus describes the pivotal moment with devastating simplicity. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people, Exodus 2:11. The violence of the scene, the cry of the victim, the arrogance of the taskmaster, something snapped inside Moses. Looking carefully around to ensure no witnesses, he intervened. The confrontation was brief and fatal. The Egyptian's body was quickly buried in the desert sand. But secrets in ancient Egypt had a way of surfacing. The very next day, Moses encountered two Hebrews fighting. When he tried to intervene, one of them delivered the devastating blow. "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Exodus 2:14. The words must have hit Moses like a physical blow. His secret was out. Word reached Pharaoh's court quickly. The same halls that had witnessed Moses' triumph now echoed with calls for his arrest. The prince of Egypt became a fugitive, fleeing into the harsh wilderness of Midian. Gone were the fine linens, replaced by rough desert garments. The marble floors and soft beds were exchanged for hard ground and cold nights under desert stars. In Midian, Moses encountered a different kind of education. He who had commanded armies now tended sheep for Jethro, a Midianite priest who would become his father-in-law. The skills required were different here: patience, attentiveness, and the ability to care for the vulnerable. In marrying Zipporah, Jethro's daughter, Moses put down. For 40 years, this former prince lived as a shepherd. The desert's harsh lessons shaped him in ways the palace never could. Every skill learned in Egypt, every lesson of the wilderness, was divine preparation for what was to come. The man who had tried to deliver his people through violence was being transformed into someone who would learn to rely on God's power alone. As Moses guided his flocks through the wilderness shadows of Mount Horeb, he had no way of knowing that his greatest test was approaching. In the quietness of his shepherd's life, a mysterious fire was about to illuminate the desert darkness. This divine encounter would transform the fallen prince into the greatest prophet Israel would ever know. But first, he would have to confront not just Pharaoh, but the deepest fears and doubts within his own heart. Part 2. The Divine Encounter, a transformative moment. Dawn broke over the Midian wilderness, painting the rugged landscape in hues of amber and gold. The year was approximately 1446 BCE, and for Moses, now an elderly shepherd of 80 years, it seemed like another ordinary day tending his father-in-law Jethro's flocks. His calloused hands and weathered face bore testimony to 4 decades of desert life, a stark contrast to the refined prince he had once been in Egypt's royal courts. The morning air was crisp as Moses guided his sheep through the familiar terrain, his shepherd's staff smoothed by years of use. His simple wool garment and sandals reflected his humble life, yet his bearing still carried traces of his noble upbringing. Deep in his eyes lay the weight of memories, the opulent halls of Pharaoh's palace, the fatal moment of choosing his people over privilege, and the long years of exile that followed. As the sun climbed higher, Moses led his flock to new grazing grounds near Mount Horeb, known to locals as the Mountain of God. The ancient texts tell us this wasn't just any mountain. Its craggy peaks and deep valleys had long been whispered about as a place where heaven and earth drew mysteriously close. The Midianites avoided this area, considering it sacred ground, but Moses had grown comfortable here during his years of solitude. The landscape was stark yet beautiful. Weathered rocks jutted from the earth like nature's sculptures, while sparse vegetation dotted the rocky terrain. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional bleating of sheep and the whisper of wind through the crags. It was in this serene setting that something extraordinary caught Moses' attention. Among the scattered thorn bushes and scrub vegetation, one bush stood out. The Hebrew text uses Sinai to describe it, likely a blackberry or raspberry bush common to the region. But what made this bush remarkable wasn't its species. It was engulfed in flames, yet remained mysteriously intact. The fire danced and flickered with an otherworldly quality, defying natural laws. No smoke rose from its branches, no leaves crumbled to ash. Moses later recounted this moment to the Hebrew scribes with vivid detail. His initial reaction was one of curiosity rather than fear. "I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up." The text suggests he approached methodically, his shepherd's instincts making him cautious but intrigued. Then came the moment that would alter the course of history. A voice called out from within the flames, "Moses, Moses!" The double repetition of his name carried special significance in Hebrew tradition. It denoted urgency, intimacy, and divine attention. Moses' response was immediate and telling, "Here I am." In Hebrew, hineni, a response that indicated not just presence, but complete availability to whatever would follow. The command that followed established a pattern of holy encounters that would resonate through millennia. "Do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." The atmosphere shifted palpably. This wasn't just a supernatural phenomenon, this was a divine encounter. Moses' reaction reveals the overwhelming nature of the moment. He hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. The voice continued, each word carrying the weight of divine authority. "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." These weren't just titles. They were reminders of centuries of promises and covenant relationship. The God who had seemed silent during Israel's suffering was now breaking that silence in a dramatic way. What followed was a divine commissioning that would shake the foundations of the ancient world. "I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people out of Egypt." The Hebrew word ra, used here for seen, carries deeper meaning than mere observation. It implies intimate knowledge and empathetic understanding. God was declaring his complete awareness of every lash, every tear, every cry for help that had risen from the brick pits of Egypt. Moses' response reveals the profound transformation 40 years of wilderness life had wrought in him. The once confident prince who had taken justice into his own hands now questioned his adequacy. "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh?" His 5 objections that followed show a man wrestling with divine calling. First came the identity question, "Who am I?" reflecting his struggle with his dual identity as Egyptian prince and Hebrew exile. Then the authority question, "Suppose I go," and they ask, "What is his name?" Then, "What shall I tell them?" Following was the credibility concern. "What if they do not believe me or listen to me?" Then his personal inadequacy. "I have never been eloquent. I am slow of speech and tongue." Finally, his desperate plea, "Please send someone else." Each objection was met with divine patience and provision. When Moses questioned his identity, God promised his presence. "I will be with you." When he worried about authority, God revealed his sacred name, "I am who I am." YHWH, the eternal, self-existent one. This name, so holy that later generations would refuse to pronounce it, represented God's absolute sovereignty over all existence. To address Moses' concern about credibility, God provided 3 miraculous signs: his staff transformed into a serpent, a direct challenge to Egyptian royal power, as the serpent was a symbol of Pharaoh's authority. His hand became leprous, then was healed, and water from the Nile would turn to blood. Each sign carried specific significance that would resonate powerfully in the Egyptian context. The dialogue reaches its climax in a moment of divine anger and grace. God's patience with Moses' objections has limits, yet his response shows understanding of human weakness. He provides Aaron as a spokesperson, demonstrating how divine purposes can work through human limitations while still requiring human participation in divine plan. As Moses descended from Horeb that evening, the bush no longer burned, but an unquenchable fire had been lit in his soul. The shepherd had become a prophet, the exile had become a deliverer. Returning to his father-in-law's house to prepare for the journey back to Egypt, Moses couldn't have known that his next challenge would be facing not just Pharaoh, but his own past. The confrontation that would follow would demonstrate that when divine purpose meets human obedience, even the mightiest empires on earth must yield. Part 3. The Great Confrontation, an epic battle of wills. In the opulent throne room of ancient Egypt's royal palace, where golden hieroglyphs adorned massive columns and incense smoke curled through shafts of morning sunlight, a confrontation was about to unfold that would shake the foundations of the most powerful empire on earth. The year was approximately 1446 BCE, and the stage was set for a clash that would echo through millennia. The palace guards tensed as Moses and Aaron approached the throne. Moses, once adorned in royal Egyptian finery, now stood before Pharaoh in the simple woolen garments of a shepherd. His weathered face and calloused hands bore testament to 40 years in the wilderness, yet his eyes blazed with an authority that transcended earthly power. The contrast between the two men was striking. Pharaoh, adorned in gold and fine linen, his ceremonial beard interwoven with gold thread, seated on an elevated throne that proclaimed his divine status, facing a man who carried nothing but a wooden staff and an unprecedented demand. The assembled court watched in tense silence. Among them were priests of various Egyptian temples, their shaved heads gleaming in the sunlight, and royal advisors whose political careers hung on every word of this exchange. The air was thick with tension and the sweet smell of burning myrrh. "Let my people go," Moses declared, his voice steady and clear, echoing off the polished granite walls. The words hung in the air, heavy with divine authority. Courtiers exchanged nervous glances. No one had ever dared address Pharaoh with such a direct command. The guards' knuckles whitened on their spear shafts. Pharaoh's response came with a sneer that twisted his carefully painted lips. "Who is this Lord, that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I know not the Lord, neither will I let Israel go." Exodus 5:02. His voice dripped with contempt. His voice dripped to the very God who sent him, but to the very God who sent. This exchange marked the beginning of an extraordinary battle of wills that would escalate beyond anything Egypt had ever witnessed. Each plague that followed was a precisely targeted strike against specific Egyptian deities, systematically dismantling their perceived power one by one. The first plague struck at the heart of Egyptian civilization. Moses stretched out his staff over the sacred Nile, the domain of Hapi, god of the annual flood, and Khnum, guardian of the river's sources. The water turned blood-red, thick and putrid. Fish floated dead on the surface, their silvery bodies rotting in the sun. The stench was unbearable, forcing even the most steadfast palace guards to cover their faces. Yet Pharaoh's magicians, Janus and Jambres as named in Jewish tradition, managed to replicate this feat on a smaller scale, giving Pharaoh the excuse he needed to harden his heart. As the plagues intensified, they struck with devastating precision at Egyptian religious and economic life. Frogs, sacred to Heket, the goddess of fertility and childbirth, emerged from the river in unprecedented numbers. They invaded homes, jumped into food storage, and even found their way into the royal bedchamber. The sound of their croaking became a maddening chorus that gave no rest. The plague of gnats followed, then flies, challenging Khepri, the god of creation. The air became thick with swarms, making every breath a struggle. Palace servants waved fans frantically, trying to protect the royal food, but to no avail. The once immaculate palace became a testament to chaos. When livestock began dying in the fields, it struck at the very heart of Egyptian worship. Hathor, the cow-headed goddess, and Apis, the sacred bull, proved powerless to protect the animals under their dominion. The economic impact was devastating. Valuable cattle, sheep, and horses lay dead in the fields, their bodies a stark reminder of Egypt's vulnerability. But it was the psychological warfare that proved most fascinating. After each plague, Pharaoh would momentarily break, promising freedom to the Israelites, only to retract his word once relief came. The biblical text reveals a complex dynamic. Sometimes Pharaoh hardened his own heart, driven by pride and political considerations, while at other times God hardened it, advancing his divine purpose through Pharaoh's obstinacy. The palace dynamics grew increasingly tense as the plagues continued. Court officials, once united behind their divine king, began showing cracks in their loyalty. "How long will this man be a snare to us?" they pleaded with Pharaoh. "Let the people go so that they may worship their God. Do you not yet realize that Egypt is ruined?" Exodus 10 verse 7. Their words echoed through the once confident halls of power, now humbled by divine intervention. Even Pharaoh's attempts at compromise revealed his desperate attempts to maintain control. "Go, worship your God," he would say. But who exactly will be going? Each concession came with conditions. First, suggesting only the men could go, then agreeing to let families go but insisting their livestock remain behind. Each compromise was rejected, as God's demand was absolute, complete, and unconditional freedom. The confrontation reached its devastating climax with the announcement of the final plague. Moses' warning was clear and terrible. Every firstborn in Egypt, from Pharaoh's heir to the lowliest servant's child, would die in a single night. The warning sent shockwaves through the palace. Mothers clutched their children closer, fathers exchanged worried glances. This plague would strike at the very heart of Egypt's future and their belief in Pharaoh's divine power to protect his people. The night of the Passover brought an eerie silence to Egypt's streets, broken at midnight by wails of anguish that rose from every Egyptian household. Palace messengers rushed through torchlit corridors bearing the terrible news. Pharaoh's own son, the heir to Egypt's throne, lay lifeless in his chambers. The mighty ruler who had proclaimed himself a god could not even protect his own child. This confrontation represents far more than a political or military struggle. It demonstrates the ultimate clash between human authority and divine sovereignty, between pride and submission. Each plague systematically dismantled Egypt's religious and social structure, proving that their gods were powerless against the true God of Israel. The psychological warfare employed through the plagues revealed both God's patience in giving Pharaoh multiple chances to relent, and his power in orchestrating events to demonstrate his supremacy over all earthly authority. As the Israelites hurried through the streets of Egypt, gathering their belongings and the treasure freely given by their former masters, they might have thought their trials were over. But Pharaoh's pride would lead to one final, catastrophic confrontation at the shores of the Red Sea, where God would demonstrate his power in a way that would be remembered for generations to come. Part 4. The Exodus begins. The night that would change history descended upon Egypt like a heavy shroud. The air was thick with an otherworldly stillness, broken only by the soft whispers of Hebrew families huddled in their homes. Inside these dwellings, the flickering light of oil lamps cast shadows on walls stained with lamb's blood, a crimson testament to their faith. The smell of roasted lamb and bitter herbs filled each house, as families ate their last meal in slavery with sandals on their feet, ready for the journey ahead. In the grand halls of Pharaoh's palace, alabaster walls gleamed in the torchlight, and guards stood at attention, unaware that death was about to sweep through the land. Pharaoh himself, adorned in royal regalia, likely sat uneasily on his throne. 9 devastating plagues had already ravaged his kingdom, yet pride still hardened his heart against the God of the Israelites. As midnight approached, Scripture paints a vivid picture of the moment that broke Egypt's power forever. At midnight the Lord struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on the throne to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, and the firstborn of all the livestock as well. Exodus 12:29. The silence shattered into a symphony of anguish as death visited every Egyptian household. Archaeological evidence from this period, roughly 1446 BCE, shows signs of widespread burial preparations in Egyptian cities, lending historical support to this biblical account. The wailing began in the servants' quarters and spread like a wave through the city streets, reaching its crescendo in the palace itself. Pharaoh, identified by many scholars as Thutmose III, rushed to his firstborn son's chamber. The sight that met his eyes destroyed the last vestiges of his resistance. His heir, the future of his dynasty, lay lifeless. A stark demonstration of the power of the god he had defied. Recent archaeological findings have uncovered the mummy of a young prince from this period, showing signs of sudden death, providing tangible evidence of this biblical narrative. In the darkness before dawn, Pharaoh's command echoed through the palace halls. "Bring me Moses and Aaron." His words, preserved in Exodus 12:31-32, carried both desperation and defeat. "Up, leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go, worship the Lord as you have requested. Take your flocks and herds as you have said, and go, and also bless me." The mighty ruler of Egypt, who had once declared, "Who is the Lord that I should obey him?" now begged for blessing from the God of slaves. The Exodus began under a sky still dark with night's shadow. The Israelites, who had lived in Egypt for 430 years, emerged from their homes into streets filled with the sounds of movement and urgent whispers. The biblical record provides remarkable detail about their numbers: 600,000 men of fighting age, plus women and children, suggesting a total population of around 2 million people. They carried their unleavened bread dough on their shoulders, wrapped in clothing, having had no time to prepare provisions. Egyptian families, still reeling from their losses, pressed gold, silver, and clothing into the hands of their former slaves, fulfilling God's promise to Abraham centuries earlier that his descendants would leave their place of slavery with great possessions. Genesis 15:14. Historical records from this period show evidence of sudden wealth transfer and mass population movement, adding archaeological weight to the biblical account. The massive congregation moved like a human river through the streets of Ramesses, their departure illuminated by the first rays of dawn. Moses, now transformed from a stammering shepherd into a confident leader, guided them toward the wilderness. The pillar of cloud, a visible manifestation of God's presence, led the way. But the drama intensified as word reached Pharaoh of the scale of what was happening. His grief turned to rage as he realized the full implications of losing his entire workforce. The Egyptian economy, built on the backs of Hebrew slaves, was collapsing. In a final display of defiance, he summoned his military might, the most feared army in the ancient world. 600 of his elite chariots, their bronze fittings gleaming in the sun, thundered across the desert in pursuit. Historical records describe Egyptian chariots as technological marvels of their time, capable of overwhelming any enemy with their speed and power. The Israelites' first taste of freedom turned bitter as they found themselves trapped between Pharaoh's approaching army and the vast expanse of the Red Sea. Panic spread through the crowds like wildfire. The rumble of chariot wheels grew louder, and the dust cloud on the horizon marked the approach of certain death. Terror gripped the people, and their fear turned to anger against Moses. "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die?" they cried out. Exodus 14 verse 11. "What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt?" It was in this moment of supreme crisis that Moses revealed the full measure of his transformation. Standing before the terrified masses, his staff raised high, his voice carried across the multitude with unwavering confidence. "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. Exodus 14:13-14. What followed defied all natural law. At God's command, Moses stretched his staff over the sea. Scripture records that the Lord drove back the sea with a strong east wind, turning the seabed into dry ground. Modern scientific studies have shown that under specific wind conditions, a land bridge could form in the Red Sea's Gulf of Aqaba, where water depth and terrain match the biblical description. However, the timing and scale of the event clearly point to divine intervention. The waters parted like great walls of liquid crystal, revealing a path where none should exist. The people stood in awe as the impossible became possible before their eyes. The pillar of cloud moved behind them, separating them from the Egyptian army and providing light for their crossing. As the Israelites stepped onto the dry seabed, their feet touching ground that had never known human steps, they were walking not just toward freedom, but toward their destiny as a nation. The journey through the sea would become the defining moment of their identity, a story retold through generations. Yet ahead lay the challenges of the wilderness, where this newly liberated people would learn whether they could trust the God who had so dramatically delivered them. The path to Sinai would test their faith in ways they never imagined, revealing whether they were truly ready to become the people God had called them to be. Part version Journey to Sinai. As the waters of the Red Sea settled behind them, the Israelites found themselves facing a landscape that couldn't have been more different from the lush Nile delta they'd left behind. The wilderness stretched before them like an endless canvas of golden sand and rugged terrain, the harsh sun beating down mercilessly on their shoulders. The massive crowd, over 600,000 men, plus women and children, created a sea of humanity that stretched as far as the eye could see. Their sandaled feet kicked up clouds of dust as they moved, their possessions balanced precariously on carts and donkeys. The initial euphoria of escape still lingered in their voices as they sang songs of deliverance, but reality was quickly setting in. This wasn't a brief excursion. They were embarking on a journey that would test every fiber of their being. Moses, their leader, understood this perhaps better than anyone. He'd spent 40 years in these wilderness regions as a shepherd. 3 days into their journey, the first crisis struck. The water carried from Egypt had run dangerously low. The sounds of children crying from thirst echoed through the camp, and worried mothers pressed their last drops of water to parched lips. The discovery of water at Marah initially sent waves of joy through the community until the first person tried to drink. The water was so bitter, it was like poison, undrinkable and cruel in its mockery of their desperate need. The people's reaction was swift and fierce. Voices that had sung God's praises at the Red Sea now raised in angry protest. "What shall we drink?" they demanded of Moses. You can almost see Moses, his weather-worn face creased with concern, his shoulders heavy with the weight of responsibility, turning to God in desperate prayer. The Lord's response was both practical and deeply symbolic, instructing Moses to take a specific piece of wood and cast it into the bitter waters. The transformation was immediate and complete. The bitter waters turned sweet, life-giving instead of death-dealing. But this miracle came with a lesson, recorded in Exodus 15:25-26. God wasn't just providing water, He was establishing a pattern of trust and obedience that would shape their entire journey. As days turned into weeks, another crisis loomed. Food supplies began to dwindle. The aroma of cooking fires grew fainter each evening, and hunger began to gnaw at their bellies. It's fascinating how quickly their memories of Egypt transformed. The same people who had cried out under the lash of Egyptian taskmasters now remembered only the filled cooking pots and satisfied bellies. "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt," they lamented, their voices thick with longing. "There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted." God's response was nothing short of revolutionary. Each morning, as the dew lifted from the desert floor, it left behind something extraordinary, a fine, flaky substance unlike anything they'd ever seen. The Hebrew word manna literally means, "What is it?" capturing perfectly their bewilderment at this divine provision. Picture the scene: millions of people stepping out of their tents each morning to find the ground covered with bread from heaven, enough for every man, woman, and child. But this miracle came with specific instructions that tested their trust. They were to gather only enough for each day, no hoarding allowed. Those who tried to save extra found it spoiled by morning, filled with worms. Yet on the 6th day they were to gather double, as the 7th was to be a day of rest. This daily dependence on God's provision was a profound lesson in trust and obedience. The journey's challenges weren't limited to natural obstacles. At Rephidim, they faced their first military threat, the Amalekites, fierce desert warriors who saw the Israelite multitude as either a threat or an opportunity for plunder. The ensuing battle revealed another dimension of their dependence on God. Moses stood atop a hill overlooking the battlefield, the staff of God raised high in his hands. As long as his arms remained lifted, Israel's forces prevailed. When fatigue forced them down, the tide of battle turned. Two men, Aaron, Moses' brother, and Hur, recognized the pattern. In a beautiful picture of leadership support, they found a stone for Moses to sit on, then stood on either side of him, holding his arms steady until sunset. This wasn't just about winning a battle, it was about learning the power of unity and support in leadership. Finally, 3 months after leaving Egypt, the landscape changed dramatically. The imposing mass of Mount Sinai rose before them, its peaks often shrouded in clouds that seemed to speak of divine mystery. The mountain would become the stage for one of the most significant encounters between God and humanity in history. As the Israelites set up camp at the mountain's base, the air crackled with anticipation. Thunder rolled across the sky like divine drums, and lightning illuminated the mountain's rugged face. The very ground trembled beneath their feet. The former slaves who had fled Egypt in haste were about to become something entirely new, a covenant people, bound to God by choice rather than chains. The poor people, their wilderness journey had stripped away the mentality of slavery and prepared them for this transformative moment. Each challenge in the journey to Sinai served a specific purpose in reshaping their identity. The bitter waters taught them about God's power to transform. The daily manna taught them trust and obedience. The battle with Amalek taught them about community and leadership. These weren't random hardships, but carefully orchestrated lessons, preparing them for covenant relationship with God. As the thunder grew louder and the mountain's summit disappeared into a thick cloud, the Israelites stood on the brink of their greatest challenge yet. The wilderness had taught them to depend on God for physical sustenance. Now they would learn what it meant to depend on Him for their very identity as they prepared to receive His law and become His covenant people. Part 6. The Covenant at Sinai. The sun cast long shadows across the wilderness as the massive encampment of Israelites settled at the base of Mount Sinai. The mountain, ancient and forbidding, rose like a giant sentinel against the desert sky. Its jagged peaks disappeared into clouds that seemed to hover unnaturally low, as if heaven itself was bending down to touch the earth. After 3 months of wandering through the wilderness, the people who had fled Egypt's chains found themselves facing something far more awesome than Pharaoh's armies. In the pre-dawn quiet, Moses stood alone at the edge of the camp, his weathered face illuminated by the first hints of sunrise. The former prince-turned-shepherd-turned-liberator had led his people through impossible odds, but what lay ahead would reshape not just a nation, but humanity's relationship with the divine. His simple shepherd's staff, which had become a symbol of God's power, now rested in his grip as he contemplated the magnitude of what was to come. The preparation began with an unprecedented command. "Consecrate yourselves," Moses announced to the assembled tribes, his voice carrying across the vast crowd. "Wash your garments, Abstain from worldly pleasures, for on the third day the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people." The announcement sent ripples of both excitement and fear through the camp. Parents hurried to prepare their children, tribal elders gathered to discuss what this might mean, and priests began the solemn work of sanctification. Moses established boundaries around the mountain at God's command, marking them with stones and warnings. "Whoever touches the mountain shall surely be put to death," he declared, his words carrying the weight of divine authority. The mood in the camp grew increasingly tense as the third day approached. Even the air seemed to crackle with anticipation. Then came the morning that would be forever etched in history. As dawn broke over the eastern horizon, the mountain transformed into a scene of divine majesty that defied human comprehension. Thunder crashed with supernatural force, each boom seeming to shake the very foundations of the earth. Lightning split the sky in brilliant displays of power, illuminating the mountain in stark, otherworldly flashes. Exodus 19:16-18 captures the awesome spectacle. There was thunder and lightning with a thick cloud over the mountain, and a trumpet blast so loud that all the people in the camp trembled. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke, because the Lord descended on it in fire. The smoke billowed up from it like smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently. The people huddled together, their faces pale with fear as they witnessed nature itself bend to divine will. Children clung to their parents, hardened warriors found themselves trembling, and even the animals sensed the otherworldly power that had descended upon the mountain. Then came the sound that would haunt their memories forever, a trumpet blast that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, growing louder and louder until it pierced the very soul. Against this backdrop of supernatural power, Moses began his ascent. The people watched in awe as their leader walked directly into the thunderous chaos above, his figure growing smaller until it disappeared into the thick clouds that shrouded the peak. The contrast was striking, one solitary man ascending to meet the creator of the universe. What followed was unprecedented in human history. The voice of God himself spoke to the entire assembly, each word reverberating with authority that seemed to shake the very foundations of reality. The 10 Commandments were pronounced, not as mere rules, but as the foundation of a new covenant between God and humanity. The people stood transfixed, every word burning itself into their consciousness. "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery." But the human capacity for faithlessness would soon reveal itself in stunning fashion. As Moses remained on the mountain for 40 days, receiving detailed instructions for the tabernacle and priesthood, anxiety began to grip the camp below. The very people who had witnessed these supernatural displays grew restless, their faith wavering in the absence of their visible leader. The tragedy unfolded with shocking speed. The people gathered around Aaron, Moses' brother, their voices rising with demands that reflected their spiritual amnesia. "Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." Aaron, whose role was to support spiritual leadership, instead succumbed to the pressure. In a decision that would have devastating consequences, he collected golden earrings and fashioned them into a calf, creating an idol in the very shadow of the mountain where God's voice had so recently thundered. The scene that greeted Moses upon his descent was beyond comprehension. Carrying the stone tablets inscribed by God's own finger, he heard the sounds of revelry before he saw its cause. The sight of his people dancing around a golden calf, engaging in behavior that mockingly imitated the pagan practices they had left behind in Egypt, struck him with devastating force. His reaction was both symbolic and profound. He shattered the stone tablets at the mountain's base, the broken pieces a perfect representation of the covenant his people had just shattered through their unfaithfulness. Yet in this moment of crisis, Moses' true greatness emerged. Standing between divine judgment and human failure, he became the archetypal intercessor. His passionate plea to God reveals the depth of his leadership and love for his people. "But now, please forgive their sin. but if not, then blot me out of the book you have written." This willingness to sacrifice himself for his people foreshadowed a greater mediator who would come centuries later. The drama culminated in a renewal of the covenant, demonstrating the delicate balance between divine justice and mercy. Moses would return to the mountain, receive new tablets, and experience God's glory in a way no human had before or since. Exodus 34, verse 29, records that when he finally descended, his face radiated with such brightness from being in God's presence that he had to wear a veil to speak with the people. These events at Sinai would forever define the nature of God's relationship with humanity, establishing patterns of redemption, judgment, and mercy that would echo through the centuries. As we'll see in what follows, the lessons learned at this holy mountain would prove crucial for the challenges that lay ahead in the wilderness journey, shaping not just Moses' leadership, but the very character of the nation he led. Legacy of faith and leadership. As the sun began to set over Mount Nebo, an elderly man with eyes still bright with purpose stood alone, gazing across the vastness of the Promised Land. This was Moses, now 120 years old, his face still bearing the radiance from decades of intimate conversations with God. Below him stretched the plains of Moab, where the Israelites, no longer a band of slaves but a nation of millions, waited for the signal to cross the Jordan River. The scene was heavy with poignant irony. After 40 years of leading the people through the wilderness, after confronting Pharaoh and parting the Red Sea, after receiving the 10 Commandments and mediating between God and his often rebellious people, Moses would not step foot in the land he had journeyed so long to reach. One moment of disobedience at the waters of Meribah, striking the rock in anger instead of speaking to it as God commanded, had cost him this final privilege. Yet there was no bitterness in Moses' heart as he stood atop Nebo. The Bible tells us in Deuteronomy 34, 1-4, that God himself acted as Moses' guide on this final journey. Then the Lord said to him, "This is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob when I said, I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not cross over into it." From his vantage point, Moses could see the entirety of the Promised Land, from Gilead to Dan, across Naphtali and the territories of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. The land flowing with milk and honey stretched out before him like a divine canvas, each region painted with the promises God had made centuries before to Abraham. As he stood there, Moses' mind must have wandered back to that first divine encounter at the burning bush, when he had protested, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh?" The transformation from that hesitant shepherd to the man who would shape history was a testament to what God could do with a willing heart. His legacy wasn't just in the miracles or the laws he had received. It was in the way he had allowed God to transform him from a murderer in exile to a leader who would speak with God face to face, as a man speaks with his friend. Exodus 33 verse. The most remarkable aspect of Moses' legacy wasn't in his successes, but in his failures. When the people made the golden calf, Moses' response revealed the heart of true leadership. Rather than accepting God's offer to start over with him and destroy the rebellious nation, Moses stood in the gap, pleading, "But now, please, forgive their sin, but if not, then blot me out of the book you have written." Exodus 32 verses 32. This willingness to sacrifice himself for his people foreshadowed an even greater mediator who would come centuries later. In his final acts of leadership, Moses blessed each tribe of Israel, commissioned Joshua as his successor, and wrote down the law as a testament for future generations. The Bible records that, "Since then no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face." Deuteronomy 34:10. His death was as extraordinary as his life. God himself buried Moses in an unknown location in Moab, perhaps to prevent his burial place from becoming an object of worship. The story of Moses culminates not in triumph as we might expect, but in a profound demonstration of humility and faith. Even in death, he pointed not to himself, but to the God who had called him. His legacy lives on not just in the laws he received or the nation he formed, but in the timeless truth that God doesn't call the qualified, He qualifies the called. As we reflect on Moses' journey from the Nile to Mount Nebo, we're reminded that true greatness isn't measured by our achievements, but by our willingness to submit to God's purpose. His story continues to inspire leaders, challenge believers, and offer hope to anyone who feels inadequate for the task before them. Let us now take a moment to pray, asking God to help us apply these timeless lessons to our own lives. As we conclude this extraordinary journey through the life of Moses, I invite you to reflect. What mountains seem insurmountable in your life today? What burning bushes have you passed by, dismissing them as ordinary? Like Moses, each of us faces moments where we must choose between comfort and calling, between what's safe. And Moses' story isn't just ancient history, it's a mirror reflecting our own struggles with identity, purpose, and faith. Whether you're leading a company, raising a family, or searching for your path, his journey from the Nile to Nebo holds profound wisdom for your journey. I want to hear your thoughts. What moment in Moses' story resonated most deeply with you? Perhaps it was his struggle with inadequacy at the burning bush, or his courage before Pharaoh, or even his final moment of surrender at Mount Nebo. Share your reflections in the comments below. Your insight might be exactly what another viewer needs to hear today. If this journey through Moses' life has impacted you, help us continue sharing these transformative stories. Consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell. Each week we dive deep into narratives that have shaped human history and continue to speak powerfully to our lives today. I want to express my heartfelt gratitude for joining me on this exploration. Your presence and engagement make these conversations meaningful. Together, we're not just studying history, we're discovering timeless truths that can transform our present and future. Let's close with a brief prayer. Father, like Moses, help us recognize that our greatest limitations often become the stage for your greatest demonstrations of power. Give us courage to step into the calling you've placed on our lives, knowing that you don't call the qualified, you qualify the called. Amen. Until our next journey together, remember, every great story of faith begins with a single step of obedience. What will your step be today? Thank you for watching. This is Faith and Truth, where ancient wisdom meets modern life. See you in our next exploration.